CovertGoBlue, it's CovertGo2, and today we are going to take a look at the release of Shadows over Innistrad, and I'm going to give you my top 10 cards that I plan to craft from this remastered set. I'm not much of a drafter, and I don't play a ton of Historic. I'm still working on changing that, so I can't make the recommendations specifically for Historic, although many of them will work in Historic. No, these are the cards I would craft for Historic Brawl for the most part, but I am looking at them as kind of my top 10 cards in the set, the cards that if you just have a few wild cards and you want to know what this gives to Historic or Historic Brawl, these are some cards to keep an eye on. So let's dive right into it. I've got an honorable mention. This I think is the best red card from the set in a set that doesn't have hardly any red cards of serious note. This is Collective Defiance. It's one in a red sorcery that escalates for 1. This is a mechanic from the set. You may pay this cost for each mode chosen beyond the first. Choose one or more. So target player discards all the cards in hand and then draws that many cards. 4 damage to target creature and 3 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So at the low cost of 3 mana, you get one of these. For 5 mana, you get all of these. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what the heck is up with the beanie hat, CGB? Look, I've got to get my hair worked on today. Okay, it's not supposed to. I can't go in with a bunch of like product in it, having it just all stuck straight up in the air like you're used to. Okay, it's flat hair, and I'm not revealing it. It's CovertGo Beanie Day. Anyway, this card. You know, like if you're playing a Koth, which is probably my favorite mono red Historic Brawl commander right now, the mode of discarding all those mountains in your hand and drawing new cards is great. We've seen the wheel effects do work before. It can target either player, which sometimes the opponent has tutored for something and you know the absolute hell in their hand, or they have a huge hand but you can mill them out. You know, that mode comes up every once in a long while. The ability to kind of kill two things, 3 damage to a planeswalker, 4 damage to a creature. Also just go face. Worst case scenario, you just hit face. I mean, this was a burn spell I played in duels because we didn't have many. So I don't think there are hardly any good red cards in this set, but I'm going to give my honorable mention to Collective Defiance. Number 10, Griff's Boon. 1 white for an enchantment aura. Enchant creature. Enchant creature gets +1/+0 and has flying. 3 and a white. Return it from the graveyard to the battlefield attached to a creature. Activate as a sorcery. Every single Sithis type Enchantress style deck wants this. Every white aggro deck wants this. My primary locations for this are Sithis and Adeline. And in those 2 spots alone, this is well worth a craft because it is definitely better than a lot of other cards in the deck. It's kind of crazy that this fits in white aggro decks, but believe me, the white aggro decks of the time of Shadows over Innistrad were extremely fast, extremely aggressive, and they did play this card. And the evasion that cheap along with a bonus is pretty strong. I like this better than a card that's rare, like say Always Watching. It's just probably going to get more hype from more people. This is a card that's more likely, in my opinion, to get the job done. Number 9 is Liliana, the Last Hope. This is a 1 and a black planeswalker. The +1, target creature gets -2/-1 until end your next turn. -2, you mill 2 cards and you return a creature from graveyard hand. And -7 is an emblem. And at the beginning of your end step, create X/2/2 black zombie creature tokens, where X is 2 plus the number of zombies you control. I don't know if this is a commander for Historic Brawl, and I don't know if it's anything more than a very niche sideboard card for Historic, but I think it's well worth the craft for all of the mono black decks that are out there because it really is a pain in the opponent's neck. The ultimate comes up much quicker than you expect because it's a 3 mana planeswalker in a format that has 1 dark ritual floating in every black deck. And the ability to fend off the opponent's creatures often means they can't even play their cards like a Thalia or thing like that. It is a really good way to kill an X1 type creature as well. And there are some X1 commanders out there, like Magda, that just can't exist with this card on the battlefield. You do end up -2ing it for value way more often, and in a deck like Yawgmoth, you're probably going to -2 this a lot to get that value. But Liliana the Last Hope is a really sweet commander. Maybe not commander, but a really sweet like Historic Brawl like filler card. My next card is Gyre Reach Sanitarium. This is a legendary land that taps for a colorless. It's a rare. 2 and a tap. Each player discards a card. Each player draws a card. Then discards a card. Why is this in there? Well, if you have discard synergy, madness, stuff that says whenever you discard a card, or graveyard synergy, stuff you want in your graveyard, all of those things make sense to run a Gyre Reach Sanitarium in. But for me, the nastiness, the real nastiness is if you have a Narset on the board. Narset Part Era Veils, and I have one in most of my blue decks. So this is going in most of my blue decks. If you have a Narset on the field and you play a Gyro Reach Sanitarium, and in their draw step, like they draw their card, and then you still within their draw step because you put a stop on it, you activate the Gyro Reach Sanitarium. They don't draw the card, but they do discard the card they just drew. And that's that. It's so mean. It's toxic gameplay. It's everything Historic Brawl was always meant to be. So that is why now I just sold every one of the blue mages who watch this on their Gyro Reach Sanitarium. The cat's out of the bag. So here's one for the creature decks that I actually think is better than Gyro Reach Sanitarium. You can get your Selfless Spirit coming in at number 6. So Selfless Spirit is 1 and a white for a 2/1 flyer. It's a Spirit Cleric. It's a rare. You can sacrifice it to give creatures you control indestructible until end of turn. This is a board wipe wrecker. This protects you from Wrath of God, Day of Judgment, Supreme Verdict, Time Wipe, and many other of the popular board wipes, Deafening Clarion. So if you are running a deck that puts creatures on the battlefield and wants those creatures to stay on the battlefield, Selfless Spirit is definitely for you. If you are running a deck with a commander that you need to stay on the battlefield, like maybe something like Terrorgrid that isn't any good until the next turn. I guess Terrorgrid's a bad example because it's mono black, but a commander with white somewhere in its color identity that you really want to survive until your next turn. I think Joda is probably a very good example of this. Golos can be a good example of this. Selfless Spirit to protect can be very, very strong. Chulane, definitely like the kind of commander that wants this. It's going to go in a lot of decks. At number 5, I have Thing in the Ice. This card is absolutely sweet in every single way. 1 and a blue, 0/4 Defender Horror. It enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters on it. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, remove ice counter. When no ice counter, you transform. What you get when you transform? 7/8. You awoken the horror. It's a Kraken. And when this creature transforms into Awoken Horror, you return all non-horror creatures to owner's hands. So you bounce all of the thingies, you flip the Thing in the Ice. This card goes into a lot of decks. It's a little bit slow, but it's so hard to get a board wipe in mono blue. It's so hard to get anything that affects most of the board without paying a ton of mana that this card actually makes the cut all over the place. It will probably see some play in decks like Phoenix, in Historic, and I don't know, is it Wizards might even sideboard into something like this. Like, it's kind of weird the spots that this comes up in Historic Brawl. Like, I want to play this in Baral, Baral, that commander, the little one with a million little spells. In all of the spell slinging commander-y type, the ones where you're like a million instants and sorceries and 4 creatures, those decks, you probably want to consider Thing in the Ice, because when you play it on 2, good stuff happens. You'll compare it to Smoldering Egg, but it's a lot better most of the time than Smoldering Egg, because the transformation can come up quickly. It only takes 4 spells, and it's possible you only paid 1 mana for each. And when you do flip it, you get immediate impact, like devastating impact on the board. At is this number 5? I counted wrong. This is number 5. Thalia's Lancers. This is 3 white for a 4/4 human knight, that rare with first strike. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a legendary card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and shuffle. So a one-shot Cis-A type effect that a lot of people are going to look at as ways to access secret commanders or really get certain commanders paired up with other cards that they really want to pair them up with. I may or may not have it this high on the list because it finds Paradox Engine. Moving on. Number 4, it's Anguished Unmaking. Exile target non-land permanent, you lose 3 life. It's 1 and a white and a black and an instant, just solid removal. If your deck plays white and black and doesn't already have a lot of very versatile and low cost removal like some 4 and 5 color decks do, you probably should consider an Anguished Unmaking. It might make it into Atraxa. For me, it definitely makes it into Niv Mizzet, and then probably Kaya and every other black-white deck wants this. Number 3, Traverse the Ulvenwald. It's a green for a sorcery at rare. Search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Dig up, lame, who cares? Delirium. If there are 4 or more types among cards in your graveyard, instead search your library for a creature or land, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So it is a tutor for creatures if you have Delirium. Delirium not always easy to get, but in some decks will be much easier than others. Any kind of graveyard strategy and Gitrog monstery type stuff. It's never terrible. Sometimes you just get a land. But if you have Delirium, having a 1-mana tutor for any creature in your deck can unlock a pretty cool toolbox of effects, or just win the game because Craterhoof is in the format. There's also various other super powerful creatures that you can fetch up in this format. So I think most green decks, especially any with any hint of a graveyard kind of vibe, are going to want Traverse the Ovenwald. Number two. It's Spell Queller. 1 and a white and a blue for a 2/3 flash flying spirit at rare. When it enters the battlefield, exile target spell with mana value 4 or less. When this leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner may cast it without paying its mana cost. It is a, what do you call it, a banishing priest for spells? I mean, I've got a lot of blue-white decks that love playing at instant speed that will probably run this. And it's not the greatest when combined with cards that wrath the board, but it does go into a number of sweet decks and a number of decks that don't usually have access to counter spells. Thalia type decks, for example. It also goes into like Bant creature decks like Chulane. Like, the Spell Queller does a lot of good stuff. And the ability to exile the spell just because they can cast it again at a later time without paying the cost, there are ways to kind of get around that. For one thing, if you had a flashback spell with the Spell Queller, just exiles, they don't get it back. Same with any kind of copy of a spell that may hit the stack sometimes. Something that got cascaded into, though, on the other hand, they could cast later when the Spell Queller died. But there are some cool things to work with. Teferi Time Raveler, the one that used to be 3 mana but is now 4, can sometimes mess up the opponent's timing with the ability of when they can cast this spell. So if this dies on your turn, they can't cast a spell on your turn. Oops, no spell for you. Spell Queller is going to go into a number of my blue-white decks. Probably not my most controlling ones like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, but in a bunch of other like kind of mid-rangey creature-y value piles, I'm going to play Spell Queller a lot. Number 1, probably no surprise. It's Emrakul. The Promised End. You've been waiting. Now here it is. It's 13 mana for that 13/13 legendary creature Eldrazi. It's a mythic. It costs 1 less for each card among types in your graveyards. Each card type among cards in your graveyards. Man, I always say it weird. When you cast this spell, you gain control of target opponent during that player's next turn. After that, the player takes an extra turn. They had to code the ability to take control of your opponent's turn into Arena for this card, and they did it. And it's going to be my number 1 project coming into the set, is getting to cast this and see how it works. It has flying, trample, and protection from instants, 13/13. If your deck puts a lot of types in the graveyard, if your deck ramps pretty hard, if your deck just wants to have a sweet value endgame, Emrakul, the Promised End is for you. I talked in a previous video about all the different decks this could go in, but I think that right away it goes into decks like Atraxa and Netheroi and Emry and like just all kinds of things. And it's pretty sweet, honestly, that you can just fill your graveyard and have a sweet end game accessible to you, because not every deck has had a go over the top end game, but now Emrakul offers that to most decks willing to pay the price, either have a lot of mana or have a good amount of types in graveyard, which isn't as hard to do as it looks. So it's my number 1 for the set. It's my first craft. It's the card I most want to make happen. Probably not as a commander ever, because I think that they just don't have enough options in colorless. It's not a fun way to play, but in a ton of different commander decks. And I'll probably go search it up with Thalia's Lancers or something like that. All right. That is my top 10 for Shadows Over Innistrad Remastered, releasing today, if you're watching this the day it comes out, on Magic the Gathering Arena. Let me know what cards I missed. Let me know what cards you're most excited about. Leave me a comment. You stayed till the end. I appreciate that very much. Remember to like, subscribe. You're cool.